Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow. Or Pokemon Red and Green if you were in Japan in '96. In 2025, these are kinda still the most popular Pokemon games. If you are deep in the fandom, and you are always playing the newest game in this series, always going back to your personal favorites like Gen 3 or Gen 5 or something, that might be hard to believe. The Gen 1 games are old and dated, but they do have remakes in Gen 3 that are mechanically deeper. But get out of that mindset for a moment. Think about your friend that's just kinda casually into Pokemon, especially if you're like in your 30s. They probably played Gen 1, maybe even only Gen 1. There is a good chance they played Gold and Silver too, but those Red and Blue games, man, that's what they remember. This is such a common thing, and it still persists. If Pokemon is referenced in mainstream media, what do you think is used? Hoenn? Unova? No, it's Kanto. It's always Kanto. Not even just Kanto, but specifically Gen 1 Kanto. Rarely is it ever Fire Red and Leaf Green. Now, this isn't about which of the games are better, or Gen 1 being dated or old-fashioned or whatever. I think the answer is a bit deeper than we realize. So, why is Gen 1 still popular in 2025? Now, the answer here seems obvious. Poke Mania, right? 1998, the series starts exploding. 1999, it only gets bigger here in the West, especially with the build-up to Pokemon the first movie. It also was getting popular right before the era of digital saturation and the internet becoming increasingly ingrained into culture. The late 90s was basically the perfect time for the series to make its cultural footprint. But when we talk about all this stuff, we're not really just talking about Gen 1. We're talking about the franchise as a whole, like the anime. When it's referenced, it's almost always referencing something from the early episodes and arcs from when he's traveling in Kanto with Misty and Brock. But regardless, I don't think this fully answers our question about Gen 1. It's only a partial answer. Not everyone that likes Gen 1 was even born around this time. And you'd be surprised how many younger fans actually like Red and Blue. I noticed this specifically with competitive. Like, Gen 1 competitive is way more popular than you think it is. So, we have a partial answer thanks to culture, so to speak. To expand on that, I do think there are some factors that separate Gen 1 even from Gen 2 when it comes to potentially popularity that we could get into. Gold and Silver was about as popular as Red and Blue. Technically, it didn't sell as well, and Pokemon the Movie 2000 didn't make as much as the first movie, but it was still ridiculously popular. There was still Pokemon everywhere in the Gen 2 era, but it was the tail end of what we called Poke Mania. And by around 2002, before Gen 3 was even here in America, it already started to show more obvious signs of serious slowdown. So let's analyze the slowdown of Pokemon's excessive popularity in 2002 and try to connect it to why it's a partial reason to Gen 1's popularity. First of all, if you lived through it, you know there's a big difference between the year 2000 and 2002. Like, big cultural changes. And you can even see it even in just the aesthetics of media between the years. Hell, even looking at music videos between these 2 years feels wildly different sometimes. So it makes sense that Pokemon would be associated with what was now an older trend. Still, when we saw the popularity explosion died down, it's just that, the explosion. I like to refer to this era of Pokemon as the normalization of the franchise's popularity, because it was still insanely popular. It just wasn't in your face everywhere like 2 years before. Parents could actually duck their heads and avoid it now. So, what replaced Pokemon exactly? Technically, nothing outright replaced it. Like I said, it was still crazy popular, but most people point to Yu-Gi-Oh! As its replacement, especially with its comparatively darker, edgier content being seen as the logical thing to move into for some fans. I think this mostly factors in fans of the TCG though, and to a certain extent, the anime, since the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime was really picking up, and only got better over the next 2 to 3 years. I also think the Pokemon anime itself also didn't do itself many favors. A lot of fans actually didn't fully grasp that this series was supposed to go on with the same characters and stuff after the Pokemon League. Ash loses, but his journey continues with the anime-only Orange Islands, and of course, Johto. The anime was still kind of popular during the Orange Islands arc, believe it or not. But I think even kids knew this was just something to keep the characters occupied until Johto. But there is the problem for the anime. Johto. If you were excited to see Ash traverse the new region the series introduced in Gold and Silver, well, you may have ended up disappointed. Something about it being kind of bland early on, combined with fans getting a bit tired of the series' excess, made a lot of people start to drop the anime. And even as it progresses, it's crazy how dry the Johto arc is compared to Kanto in the anime. Misty and Brock don't have much going on this time. Ash's team is handled a bit weirdly, and the new Pokemon don't get as much development with only a few exceptions. And that's not even getting into the GS Ball storyline. It's not an outright horrible season of TV, but a lot of people were way more into Hoenn and Sinnoh's story arcs in the anime when those came along. And for good reason in my opinion. Even though I did thoroughly enjoy the Johto anime as a kid, especially waking up on Saturday mornings at 9 o'clock. The anime was a huge part of why fans, especially in the West, first got into Pokemon or heard of it in the 90s. So, it being kind of mid also didn't help with a certain set of fans. And with other stuff getting popular, and the Game Boy Color no longer being Nintendo's newest system, it was always going to be an uphill battle to keep the same momentum from like 1999. Going into 2003, we had Ruby and Sapphire, and while some people maybe felt those games were too disconnected from Gen 1 and 2, I wouldn't really factor it as the primary reason for the disconnect some of the casual fans had back then, as Poke Mania was definitely already over by the time those games came out. So if you were into this series in 1999, but lapsed at around 2003, then yeah, you're going to be a Gen 1 fan, of course. Maybe Gen 2, but it always seems to be the first one. They were just too popular. But all of the reasons I gave only paint a partial picture. This would certainly explain why it's referenced in pop culture the most. But let's look at the game itself and its merits to see why it's remembered so much as a game. I've tried to avoid talking about the quality of the game overall, because I know some of you are dying to label people who have Gen 1 as their favorite as shallow Gen 1ers or whatever. But I do think there is some merit besides nostalgia to love these games. But even though the games are pretty old and show it compared to literally anything after, including Gen 2, it is really easy to get into. But on top of that, let's think about the context of when it came out. There was nothing like Pokemon on the Game Boy back then. Sure, we had some RPGs, but Pokemon felt so fresh and grand on the system. And 151 creatures with their own cool designs and little bits of lore, it felt like such a big deal to have it in your pocket. Compare this to Ruby and Sapphire on the Game Boy Advance. Great games, but not as unique in the context of that system. The GBA had a ton of RPGs, and while a lot of them were ports or remakes of older home consoles, it had a lot of original stuff too. Pokemon was still unique enough in its own right, but regardless of how much better I personally think some of these games are, I always felt that the GBA and DS having so many big heavy hitters in the RPG genre made this series feel a bit less like a big deal on those respective consoles at the time they were new. With Red and Blue, in 1998, those were really special for original Game Boy games. And remember, there's no generations. Those were it. That was Pokemon. 151 felt big for that kind of game. I don't want to romanticize it too much, but it's important to explain how it actually felt at the time if you were alive for it. We can't find the thread now, But my editor found a thread on Reddit years ago about a player who loved Red and Blue, and every now and then, this user would replay the game. And that ended up being the only Pokemon game he played for 20 years. He finally ended up playing Gen 2, and he was so blown away, he had to make a thread about the little changes and improvements, and was really immersed when he saw two trainers battling on the field. You know, the one that blocks you early in the game when you try to go to Violet City. It really does put into perspective on how much Gen 2 improves upon the game in little ways a lot of us have lost sight of due to being so overly focused on certain aspects of the series as we analyze it over and over again. But think about the fact that every couple years, this guy always went back to play Red and Blue and never moved on. I think that's just how it is for a lot of people. They don't hate the new games, they just liked the originals and felt happy to just replay it to get their fix. They're not exactly small games. Yeah, next to like the DS games, it may seem small and feature dry, but they're pretty solid standard RPGs if you don't care about all that extra stuff. And completing the Pokédex from scratch is a much more feasible feat than later games if you're going for a 100% run, that is. And there's going to be something satisfying about that for a certain kind of fan. For them, less is more sometimes. Obviously for me, while I like Gen 1, I'd still take Gens 2 through 5 for my casual Pokemon replay in most instances. Speaking of that, I recently played Pokemon Sword Silver, a Gen 3 ROM hack taking place 20 years in the future in Johto, with a lot of amazing quality of life features. If you would be interested in checking out a full playthrough of that, you can catch that on Miss Magius. But you know what? I almost forgot to mention something else that has sort of kept Gen 1 in the front of our consciousness more than you may expect. The early to mid 2010s. I'm thinking like 2010 to 2014. But what happened during those years? Well, most Pokemon fans that grew up with Red and Blue, the early anime episodes, and the general explosion of the series were now college age. And it felt like they were referenced more at around that time than in the late 2000s. This tends to happen a lot with people when they hit like age 20. They look back on stuff from their childhood with people their age. Happened a lot in the early 2000s with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and G.I. Joe, for example. Think of all the Red is better than Ash or other Gen 1 related memes that were everywhere at the time. It also meant that the newest game that would try anything new was likely to get a lot of flack from nostalgic fans, which ended up being Black and White. Though, people who didn't give those games a fair shake goes way beyond nostalgic Gen 1 fans. I think X and Y had a similar issue too. Regardless of what you think of those games, I feel like more of us were talking about Twitch Plays Pokemon than Gen 6 in 2014, which again brought Pokemon Red and Blue back into mainstream consciousness. To a much lesser degree, there's also the mechanics. Overall, I'd say Gens 2 and 3 did a good job of rebalancing the game with their addition of types, abilities, and bug fixes. But a lot of people liked the streamlined nature and weird balance of Red, Blue, and Yellow. Psychic types and normal types are real strong, and people just kind of accepted it back in the 90s. Mewtwo and Mew being psychic types helped shape the perception that they were just supposed to be the strongest typing intentionally. And the idea that psychic was canonically supposed to leave an impression as a typing is actually somewhat true, if interviews are to be believed. No abilities also meant the game felt really streamlined, which some people just like. Everyone back then had a moment where they used Earthquake on Weezing for the first time in Gen 3, saw it missed due to the newly introduced Levitate, and got irrationally angry because they weren't used to the concept of abilities yet. Even if Gen 1 isn't your favorite, it is interesting to appreciate in relation to the games that came after. My editor, for example, is a big fan of how different the game balance is mechanically compared to Gen 3, and thinks it makes going through the series a lot more fun than just wishing it had Emerald's mechanics slapped onto it. That being said, even back in the day, fans did wish there were more Ghost and Dragon types. But we kinda just accepted that Gengar and Dragonite were supposed to be special or something. So the reason is complicated. It's easy to take the list of reasons and say, 90s nostalgia, or they came first. And while those are major reasons, they don't fill out the nuanced picture. There's definitely a before and after that exists within the Pokemon series culturally for some of the reasons I pointed out earlier. The anime going through story arcs, the change in consoles with the introduction of the GBA, new trends coming in after all the Pokemon oversaturation from 1998 to 2001, even the world changing as a whole at around that time as well. It's a lot. Personally, I am fine with that era of Pokemon still being the most recognized in mainstream media, but that's because I was able to live it. So I don't usually think twice about it. But what do you think? Do you think there are other reasons that Gen 1 remains really popular? Does it annoy you? Or are you one of those people that has a fondness for Gen 1? I'm especially curious if you're a fan of it that wasn't around when the game was new. Let me know your thoughts down below.